Hello everyone, welcome back to the Salem Witch Trials, and hopefully the last part of the Afflicted. There were many reasons for Thomas Putnam Jr.'s family to suffer from witchcraft in 1692. As the oldest son of Thomas Putnam Sr., the wealthiest patriarch in Salem village, Thomas Jr. must have grown up expecting a similar life of power and privilege. A favourable marriage to Anne Carr, the daughter of the wealthy George Carr of Salisbury, promised economic opportunity and further prosperity. The Putnams engaged in a prolonged and bitter legal battle over the estate of both their fathers, that ended in disappointment. Of course it did. The Carr estate had to be divided among 9 children, and the eldest son received a double portion. So Anne and the other siblings each received just 10% of their father's wealth. Thomas must have been particularly galled to see the lion's share of his father's estate pass to his youngest half-brother, Joseph Putnam. To add insult to injury, when he was just 20, Joseph had married Elizabeth Porter, daughter of Israel Porter, the very wealthy political opponent of the Putnam family. In addition, Thomas was passed over for the offices he might have been expected to garner. His father served as a Salem selectman, but the highest office the younger Thomas ever reached was constable. His father had been a lieutenant in the militia, and his uncle Eleazar Holyoke had been a prominent captain in King Philip's War. Thomas Jr. attained only the rank of sergeant, while other members of the family with less field experiences served as captain. So Thomas, Anne, and their 10 children had been denied the comfortable life and the status they had anticipated. Even worse, Thomas would never have the land or the money to provide farms for all his sons and proper dowries for all his daughters, and the war eliminated the possibility of starting farms on the frontier. When Thomas and Anne died, within 2 weeks of each other in 1699, he left an estate of £437, but it was encumbered with almost £200 of debt. This most atypical man left a very typical estate. It was just a sort of economic uncertainty faced by Putnam and his family that bedevilled Salem village and all of Essex County in 1692 and created an atmosphere conducive to the spread of witchcraft. A look at other leading afflicted accusers suggests that many of them faced an uncertain future as well. More than half of Salem's unmarried bewitched girls between the ages of 16 and 24 had lost their fathers. Some were orphans. Mercy Lewis, Mercy Short, Mary Warren, Sarah Churchwell, and Elizabeth Hubbard were all servants. Hubbard, Warren, Lewis, and Short were orphans, and Lewis and Short had lost their parents in Native American raids. Sarah Churchwell's father was alive, but the once prominent refugee family now lived in reduced circumstances. Susanna Sheldon was another war refugee, living with a recently widowed mother. Orphans, refugees, and servants lacked the dowries that would be necessary for a good marriage. These girls had good reason to believe that Satan might be tormenting them. Even Betty Paris and Abigail Williams lived in a parsonage that lacked firewood, and Reverend Paris, as we've seen, had difficulty collecting his salary, so their future was in question as well. What caused the afflictions in Salem? It's easier to say what did not happen than it is to what happened. Salem was not seized by a mass outbreak of ergot poisoning, encephalitis, or some other physical ailment or disease, nor was fortune-telling or voodoo to blame. Many preconditions led to the Salem outbreak, and there was more than one explanation for people's torments. In fact, it is possible that 1 or 2 people had physical ailments, such as epileptic seizures. They could have been interpreted as the work of a witch. Most of the sufferings likely came as a result of some combination of psychological ailments. Some may have suffered a psychological disorder, such as sleep paralysis or post-traumatic stress. Others may have been victims of conversion disorder and mass hysteria that resulted from the grim circumstances confronted by citizens of Salem Village in New England in 1692. A disastrous and costly war, and exacerbated existing economic, political, and spiritual tensions. Meanwhile, in Salem Village, Samuel Parris's combative and unyielding nature would harden factional lines. Just as there is evidence to support a mass psychosis, there is evidence of deliberate acts of fraud. And the fact that someone was afflicted by a psychological disorder that was beyond his or her control does not rule out the possibility that some of that person's actions were deliberate and willful acts of calumny and deception. Once Bridget Bishop had been executed, a line had been crossed. After this point, no one would admit to false accusations, for to do so would be to confess to a murderous conspiracy. As the case of Mary Warren demonstrates, once a young woman had joined the ranks of the accusers, no recanting or changing of sides was possible, even when she recovered from her afflictions and recognised that she had made false accusations. Most who have studied the witch trials will admit that some fraud took place and that psychological factors were at play as well. However, there is no agreement as to where to place the emphasis. Certainly it's easier to see false testimony when it is clearly laid out in such documents as the recantations by the accused Margaret Jacobs. The Lord, I hope, in whom I trust, out of the abundance of his mercy, will forgive me and my false forswearing myself. What I said was altogether false against my grandfather and Mr. Burroughs, which I did to save my life and to have my liberty. We all appreciate the relative certainty of such written records. The evidence of a mass hysteria is much less direct and more problematic for those who are not trained psychiatrists or psychologists. In the end, to explain the symptoms of afflictions, one has to side with Samuel Parris, who saw possession, or Jonathan Edwards, who saw ecstasy. Before making that choice, we need to look at the people whom the afflicted accused in 1692. For by learning more about the alleged witches of Salem, we can gain insight into what may have been behind the behaviour and accusations of those who were afflicted or bewitched. And that's the end of the Salem witch trials, the afflicted. When we come back, we'll then start to look at the accused. We have to look at both sides, and we have to look at the accused and the afflicted, because it will teach us what their family life was like. It will teach us of the characters that they were, and it will probably show us more than likely that these trials, these accusations, all this stuff that went on was probably fraudulent and much more to do with envy, politics, power, money, that kind of stuff, you know. Thank you for listening to this part, and many blessings.